Kayen Donji, Chapel Hill, North Carolina, Gaye, Gakaba, Kangandao. Good morning, everyone. I've just greeted you in Ojibwe. That is the language of my community. My father is a citizen of the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa Indians in north central North Dakota, and I am thrilled to be with you here today, along with my students from History 301. I am going to share my screen with you so that we can just walk through a little bit of what History 301 was, where we are at Carleton College, and certainly then also proceed directly into the student presentations. All right, can you see the screen all right? Thank you so much. So the land acknowledgement that I'm about to share with you is longer than the one that you have seen for Northfield and for Carleton College. This is the one that is specific to History 301, to this class. And so you should just know that this is not the official land acknowledgement of Northfield or Carleton, but this is the one that my students and I have been using to orient ourselves for this term. At Carleton, we know that we occupy the homelands of the Wapekute and Mdewakanton bands of the Dakota Nation. Dakota people have stewarded the lands we currently understand as southern Minnesota since time immemorial. However, throughout the early and mid-1800s, settlers' coercive and deceitful treaty-making practices drastically diminished Dakota territories, disrupting their right to be in relation with this place. By the 1860s, Dakota people faced severe food shortages due to settler incursions into their space and broken treaties. This erupted into the U.S.-Dakota War of 1862, at the end of which the state of Minnesota forcibly exiled Dakota people from their territories. Carleton was founded just 3 years later. Today, Dakota communities live in Nebraska, Canada, North Dakota, and South Dakota, as well as in intertribal urban spaces around the world, and here in Minnesota, Mahoche. The Dakota tribes whose territorial boundaries share those of Minnesota today are the Prairie Island Indian Community, Shakopee Mdewakanton Indian Community, Lower Sioux Indian Community, and Upper Sioux Community. Through our courses and community collaborations, some faculty and students at Carleton are working to acknowledge this history and build better relations with our Dakota neighbors. We extend gratitude for their stewardship of these lands since time immemorial, and we know that it is up to each of us to work to repair these devastating colonial interruptions by sharing accurate histories, building and sustaining meaningful relationships, and working together to create strong partnerships. As we look to the future, we reckon with our role in ongoing threats to Dakota sovereignty and Dakota well-being. We know it will take significant, consistent, and ongoing work to counter these wrongs, and we've identified honest storytelling as one place to start. This course has been one way of beginning that work. So in History 301, we got together 14 students ranging from sophomores to seniors, trying to answer that call of the land acknowledgement. The students were from majors across the college, and together we engaged in an investigation of how Indigenous histories and presence have shaped our campus through both archival and oral history research. So the students really set out to do three things. They set out to situate Carleton's history alongside the histories of Dakota people in Anishinaabeg and what's currently Minnesota. They proposed and enacted their own significant original research that you'll hear about today, and they are now sharing their findings in publicly accessible ways as their way of returning the knowledge they've acquired to the community. In this work, we owe particular thanks to Ramona Kiddo-Stately, who is here with us on the call today. Ramona, thank you so much. Ramona is with We Are Still Here Minnesota. Please look into the work of that organization. We also give thanks to Tom Lamb and Sarah Calhoun and Rebecca Bramlett for their support on the research side, and to Caitlin Green for organizing this today with the Northfield Public Library. And we also certainly extend our deep gratitude to the many authors whose work we read, both together and for our individual projects. This work began with a set of questions. What are the Indigenous histories of Carleton College, and why are they not more widely known? How did Carleton acquire its land base in the first place? What else should we need to know about the Arb, a place that certainly has many stories that surround it, but about which we actually knew relatively little when it came to Dakota presence? How have Native students on campus represented themselves? How have they organized for their own social and political purposes? What is the history of the population of Native students and faculty and staff on our campus? And how have Native people been represented on our campus over time? So today you're going to hear the students' answers to those questions. I've started with an overview, and we're going to now proceed in 3 core groups of student research. The students worked in thread groups throughout the term of lands, students, and representations, with each focusing on exactly what that title says. And so now we'll proceed in that order. The land group will begin. They'll then pass it off to the students representing the student group, who will pass it off to the group that focused on representations. We'll wrap then with some concluding thoughts and then go into the Q&A. And again, as Caitlin mentioned, please hold your questions until the end. You can pop them in the chat at that point or use the raised hand function, and I will be happy to call on you. So now I will turn it over to the students in the land group to share with us their findings.
Thank you so much, Meredith. We're going to start by briefly introducing ourselves. So just to start, my name is Jack. I'm a history major and I'm a junior at Carleton.
I'm Christoph. I'm a senior and I'm a chemistry major.
I'm Izzy. I am a junior environmental studies major.
I'm Declan. I am a junior geology major.
And my name's Anna. I am a senior psychology major.
All right, so really echoing Meredith's point about the land acknowledgement, we're going to frame our discussion to begin with looking at Northfield as a Dakota place. So we understand that the settler narrative of Northfield begins around the 1850s, but looking at the Indigenous perspective of this land, it goes back pretty much to all eternity in their creation narrative, stemming from the Bedote, or the confluence of the Minnesota and the Mississippi rivers in Minneapolis. So how do we understand this alternative narrative? One way that we can see it physically and close to Northfield, looking at Northfield as a place that is not a place that was void of Native presence whatsoever. We can see mentions of Castle Rock, which is pictured on the left, which is directly in Northfield's vicinity. And Castle Rock is not the only sign that we're able to infer Native presence. Beyond the actual oral histories themselves, we're able to understand that through reading history against the grain, the narratives that paint settler presence as coming to Northfield as an empty place void of Native presence are absolutely false. One of the ways that we know this is that looking at the map on the right, Northfield is in the vicinity of multiple Dakota peoples. The Midawakatan and the Wapakute both specifically are in the vicinity of Northfield, and understanding that these people have a totally different view of the land than what a settler that comes to this land would have understood as. Land is viewed as a relation and something to be shared, and that has a responsibility of care that is very different than the economy of political private property and the other things that different settler groups are bringing to this area. And meanwhile, we're able to see through Wapakute's actual practices that they were moving around through the seasons. So we have an immense body of evidence that Northfield was, if anything, very much a significant Dakota place for multiple groups of people. And it has a long history that extends far beyond the 1850s and the settler narrative. So this brings the question, how did this happen and why? And what does it mean for us today? So with that, Christoph is going to talk about the initial era of dispossession.
Yeah. Hi. So, understanding Northfield as a Dakota place, I wanted my project to focus on the founding of Carleton during the years of 1866 to 1870, and how did Carleton get the land during that period and acquire wealth during that period, and how is that linked with Native dispossession in a way that's active, and Carleton is not an exception from this rule. So in my early research I found that definitely Carleton is not an exception. It cannot be an exception. When we think of the context, the land that Carleton is on now, all of the land that it's on, and the land that Northfield is on, was seized under the Treaty of 1851 in Mendota through coercive and deceitful treaty-making practices on the part of the United States government. The documents presented by the government were often fraudulent and mistranslated, and the promises given to Dakota people were not upheld, either in the annuities that were owed to Dakota people or the promise of land along the Minnesota River. And as a result of this hardship and forced to starvation, Dakota people rose up in 1862 in what we know as the US-Dakota War. As a result, they were forcibly exiled from their homelands, and 38 Dakota men were hung in Mankato in what we know as the largest single-day execution in United States history. So in that context, it's really hard to view Carleton as neutral and see it just 4 years later as opportunistic in terms of founding the land, the 25 acres that it was founded on, where Willis Hall was built in 1872. So then in my research, I looked at a book shortly after in 1879 that talks about the founding of the college through a guy named Malcolm Dana that was very much a fan and wanted to record everything that the founders did and how they did it, why they did it. And that is just really filled with what surprised, I think, all of us, is the very Christianizing mission, like Christian ethos of Carleton when it was founded as Northfield College, since that's something we don't necessarily see today, but that we do know of the time was very linked to the idea of dispossession and what civilization meant as replacing Indigenous presence with settlers and trying to erase Native presence. So that book is filled a lot with like the heroism of Christian colleges, and we know that that plays a role in how universities were even profitable at the time. We read about examples of so-called Indian colleges being presented as a way to get funds from donors, but that were often actually never used to educate Native scholars, and the funds were used to fund the college that all the white scholars were going to. So that definitely fits into the examples at the time. And then getting into my archival work, I was looking for how would this be a parallel at Carleton, and I found the subscription rolls for donations to the early college. And so on the far right is a long list of people who've signed up to donate money in 1866 to the founding of the college. And there are about 210 donors that donated $18,000 altogether. And in the context of Dana's book, I was really feeling that, or I knew that these donors were inspired by the Christian mission of the college. And it talks about how everyone was buying in and willing to sacrifice for this college. But it is that idea that they would be bringing civilization to the West that was rousing so many people to donate from the community of Northfield. And then I found a couple notes as well referring to these donations, that a lot of them just showed the amounts people donated. Trustees donating up to like $6,000, which was a large amount at the time, down to people donating $10, $15, $20 to the college because they were so moved. But one note in particular stood out to me that was from a friend of the president at the time, President Strong. There was a trustee, and he was later a trustee and mentioned that he was donating for the debt that he owed to the early settlers of the time. So that there very much is this narrative of settlers coming and firsting, and replacing, trying to replace Native presence on the land. And that was foundational when Carleton was first founded. But then I'd like to turn it over to the other presenters now that will take us more into recent history of dispossession and talk about acquisitions in the Arboretum.
Hi, everyone. So for my research project, I've been looking into how settler land use has been used to replace and in turn erase Indigenous people's presence on the landscape. So the Cowling Arboretum was created under the leadership of President Donald Cowling and Professor Harvey Stork in the early 1920s. It's still unknown what the original plan was when we acquired the 800 acres that are now the Arboretum, but a general consensus is Cowling was creating the opportunity for future expansion of the college. There's some documented interest in starting a college arboretum as early as 1894, but the effort didn't really gain traction until Harvey Stork joined the faculty as a professor of botany and natural history in 1920. So yeah, as I previously mentioned, my individual research has been looking at how settler presence has inevitably changed the land to fit European practices and European aesthetics. And a big part of that is European agricultural practices have often been used to established settlements on Indigenous land and the introduction of European plant species has left a lasting mark on the landscape as well. I mentioned this section in my research because although much of the land Carleton acquired was already in agricultural use, you can see in this photo, this is the Carleton farm from approximately 1914. And even though this land was already in agricultural use, Carleton benefited financially from these practices. And it's important to identify our place in this history. Looking at the landscape today, it's easy to forget how our actions have altered the land. But recognizing that what we see when we look outside is not necessarily what is supposed to be there is an important step in recognizing how settler presence drastically affected the lives of Dakota people already here in what we now refer to as Northfield. I'm going to pass the presentation on to Declan to talk a little bit more about Arboretum specifics.
Hello. For part of my research, I sought to discern the extent of native erasure and representation within the Arboretum that Izzy just mentioned under Stork. I ground my analysis by paralleling the Arboretum's interpretive history alongside the National Park Services, an entity that has a very long tradition of native dispossession, native erasure, and misrepresentation within its interpretive materials. In aid of my research, I used nature trail bulletins, newspaper articles, Arboretum reports, and a variety of publications by Harvey Stork himself, all within these general categories, all collected from within the Carleton archives. So as he mentioned, the Arboretum was established and Stork was the main person behind it. And starting in the 1930s, he began to develop two major interpretive initiatives for the Cowling Arboretum. We have the self-guiding nature trail and the Trailside Museums. They also called the nature shrines in the archival material. It is not explained as to why, but it might be an homage to a national park, I would imagine, because Stork had a lot of history with the National Park Service. These initiatives were deliberately crafted by Stork to ask questions of the trailgoer and to encourage further observation, as he claimed to have been discouraged by the limitation of curiosity he saw on tours during his summers with the National Park Service, primarily in Yellowstone National Park. The self-guiding nature trail was directly tied to a weekly mimeographed nature trail bulletin, which is organized with up to 50 numbered stakes along the trail. Each stake corresponded to a paragraph or line describing what to look for on the trail, oftentimes with the inclusion of a bit of extra information or trivia about the subject of interest. Notably, Indigenous peoples were mentioned within these documents, but almost exclusively as trivia related to plant usage. In addition, these bulletins treated Native culture as entertainment for trailgoers, homogenized Native communities with the catch-all term Indian, and relegated Native communities to the past through associations with pioneers and the use of past tense verbiage. And finally, Stork's Trailside Museums were an attempt to decentralize the larger museum by presenting stories about nature within nature. His displays tackled many natural topics, from the geology of the area to the type of mushrooms that commonly grew. However, Stork notably never dealt with any human narratives, settler or native, perhaps due to his belief that nature should be portrayed unspoiled by human activity. This idea conflicts with the Dakota view of the land as being in relation to humanity that we talked about a little bit at the beginning. And like the National Park Service, Stork preferred to portray the herb as a vacant wilderness, free from human activity. However, interestingly enough, unlike the National Park Service, he didn't make an exception for the settler narrative, a unique divergence from their methodology. And now I will pass it on to Anna.
Good morning, everyone. So a lot of what we've talked about so far is how Carleton acquired its land and how we use this land. So for my research project, I was hoping to gain some clarity on whether Arboretum conservation practices and ethos were impacted by growing Indigenous-led activist movements. So specifically, I wanted to know if and how the Red Power movement of the late 60s and early 70s impacted the ethos surrounding conservation within the Arboretum. So the Red Power movement refers to a period of highly public confrontational protests led by young urban and rural Native Americans to affirm their right to make policies and programs for themselves while maintaining and controlling their own land and resources. If you were around during this time period from 1969 to 1973, you might remember the occupation of Alcatraz Island and the occupation of the BIA office in Washington, D.C., and the occupation of Wounded Knee, South Dakota in 1973. So the Red Power movement, like I said, was at its height during the years 1969 to 1973. And plenty of action was based out of the Twin Cities, just 45 miles away from Carleton's campus. For example, the American Indian movement was founded in St. Paul by a group of Ojibwa men, and St. Paul hosted the trials of AIM leaders Dennis Banks and Russell Means after the occupation of Wounded Knee in 1973. Like other civil rights movements of its day, the movement was heavily backed by college students. However, in my looking through the Carletonian archives and other archives at Carleton, I found scant evidence that Carleton students or the institution were involved or even very interested in the matter. In fact, several of the articles covering the American Indian movement and associated events in the Carletonian actually cover events that happened on St. Olaf's campus. Next slide, please. So the new vision period of the Carleton Arboretum, in which the Arb kind of shifted its focus to conservation, began in the same time period as the Red Power movement. Although I could find no direct link between conservation in the Arb and the Red Power movement, I did find what I'll call a long-term ripple effect of the Red Power movement on the Carleton Arb. So the Red Power movement is recognized as a flashpoint in Indigenous activism that increased publicity around Indigenous resistance and is particularly tied to an uptick in environmental focused activism. So this activism brought increased awareness of Indigenous connections to land and has inspired lots of literature on the subject that has permeated academia. And so we see ripple effects of this on our campus here in Northfield as the various offices that work with the Arboretum incorporate Indigenous issues into their course offerings, service work, and approaches to conservation. The Arboretum as a natural space and as an educational space offers many opportunities for Carleton and the city of Northfield to enter into better relation with the Dakota people that our institution has displaced. That wraps up our portion on land, and next up is a research group focused on students, I believe.
Great. So we're the students group, which means that we'll be talking today about Native student organizing and experiences at Carleton College. So to start out, my name is Zoe Farrow. I'm a current senior political science major from Durham, North Carolina, and I use she, her pronouns. And next slide, if possible. Okay, so to start out, I'm going to walk us through just a basic timeline. So the first Native student organization at Carleton was founded in 1981, and it was founded under the name Native Americans with a Future. And we know that this organization was formally chartered through CSA, which is the Carleton Student Association, which means that they received funding for events and did bring speakers to campus over subsequent years. Traveling along, if you follow along with me, in 1986, the organization name changed to ANPO, or the American Native Peoples Association. Though the name changed, the transition did not seem to indicate any cessation in activity. Instead, this marks the beginning of ANPO's most active period. Though young, the group's membership grew fast. They sponsored field trips, films, guest speakers. And in 1988, after having their budget briefly frozen by CSA, which was a very controversial issue on campus, they were able to go ahead and they hosted their first powwow. In 1999, they hold another powwow, which this one is entirely organized by students. So they call it their first annual. So even though they hosted one before, they're starting a new tradition in 1999, in which every year they hold a powwow on campus. The organization continues to gain membership until 2004, at which point things go mysteriously silent. So there's no record between 2004 and 2015, a very large gap. Then in January 2015, a new organization is formed, this one under a new name, the Indigenous Peoples Alliance, which was started by 3 Native students, and they actually held the first Indigenous Peoples Day on campus. The organization continues to gain membership for 3 more years until 2018, in which the group consisted of almost all seniors and they all graduated. So the organization dies out at that point. So again, there's a gap. So between 2018 and this year, actually, there isn't much activity. And about a month ago, actually, a few students in this class rechartered IPA. So it's under the same name, but they had to go through the entire process again in order to establish it as a student organization. And next slide. Okay, and then next, I just want to briefly display Carleton's enrollment numbers over time. The blue line to the left is the total enrollment of students over the years, which, as you can see, fluctuates a bit, but generally increases steadily. To the right in orange is the documented population of Native students that we have. And this data is by no means exhaustive, as many students did not openly identify while they were on campus. But what it does show is that, and it's a little weird to have the scale next to each other, but you can see on the right the numbers. There's an average of about 2 Native students kind of every other year, and that's rough. But what this means is that only 1 to 4 Native students were admitted to Carleton in many years, and often there were years in which no Native students were admitted. As we know, again, the data is flawed in some ways. But though it's hard to see, between 2015 and 2018, when IPA died out, that gap period, there were no Native students admitted to Carleton. And next slide. So what I found, and what this shows, both these graphs and both the timeline of student organizations at Carleton, is that the success of Native student organizations often hinges on a handful of existing students and relies on the arrival of 1 to 2 additional Native students on campus each year. In years in which no Native students were admitted, upperclassmen were unable to pass on their institutional knowledge and their administrative knowledge, and the organization either suffered or it died out completely. So really, enrollment is, especially at the size of an institution like Carleton, is vital for these organizations persisting and being able to hand on that knowledge. Very briefly, other factors that marked the success or dissolution of these groups were faculty mentorship, discussions of diversity, CSA funding, support from the Multicultural Affairs Office and other minority student organizations like LASSO, and Native students in student leadership positions and being empowered to continue the organization. As a final example, this year, I mentioned a few people in this class led the reestablishment of IPA on campus, and they credit both the mentorship of Meredith and the connections they gained in this class with them being able to do so. So I'm going to now pass it on to Anna, who will talk more about the specific activities of ANPO.
Tlaki newa ninotoka Ana, newa ni de Mexico Guerrero, de ese pueblo Nahua Samiga Tequisiepan. Hello, my name is Ana. I am from Mexico Guerrero, from a Nahua pueblo Samiga Tequisiepan. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a junior at Carleton. I'll be exploring how the relationships ANPO made help with Native students' resistance and persistence at Carleton. The majority of my primary sources came from the Carletonian archives, but for this presentation, I will be sharing archive information from the Algo yearbooks and Carleton's alumni magazine, The Voice. As Zoe mentioned, the earliest time we see ANPO in the archives is in 1986. However, as you can see here, ANPO wasn't included in the Algo yearbooks till 1999, when ANPO was revived after some period of it being inactive. Next slide, please. The visual was an event that was planned between ANPO, Asia, LASSO, Seoul, and the Multicultural Affairs Center in 1988. For context, the Multicultural Affairs Center is what the oil thing and the ISO office used to be called. And before it was called the Multicultural Affairs Center, it was called the Third World Center. The organizations and office I just mentioned were some of the strongest relationships that ANPO had at Carleton. During this 24-hour event, minority students were able to combine their presence to demand for more recruitment of minority students, which coincides with ANPO's demand for more Native student recruitment. Since, as Zoe mentioned, lack of Native students at Carleton has been one of the biggest factors as to why Native organizations become inactive. 300 students, staff, faculty, trustees, and administrators attended this event. Next slide, please. While ANPO members were able to travel outside of Carleton to attend powwows, they wanted to have one in the Northfield area. So in 1999, ANPO hosted its quote-unquote first annual campus powwow. I say quote-unquote first, as ANPO previously hosted a powwow in 1988. The invisibility of Native students at Carleton was prevalent, and this powwow was a way for Native students to make themselves visible on campus and to stay connected to their Native identity. This powwow was advertised through word of mouth, newspapers, and magazines, and reached as far as Iowa, Wisconsin, and Canada. This event was sponsored by ANPO, the Multicultural Affairs Center, the American Studies Department, and the Educational Studies Department. ANPO also had help from Carleton art students who helped design and print posters and t-shirts for this event. The picture on the right side, the person all the way on the right, is Educational Studies Professor Mary Hermes from Lacritus Orales Ojibwe community member, who was a Native faculty at the time until she left in the year 2000 to move back to her reservation. She was vital in ANPO's success and connecting them with the Native community in the surrounding area. One thing to take away from this is that the relationships that ANPO formed help Native students with information exchange, financial support, and empowerment of a number of people. Thank you, and I will now pass it on to Imani, who will talk more about individual Native students at Carleton.
Hello, my name is Imani Kindness Coleman. I am from Montana. I'm a member of the Apsalagan Nation. I'm an American Studies major, class of 2022, and I use she, her pronouns. In my research, I chose to focus on acts of survivance by individual students on campus. Indigenous scholar Gerald Visner coined the term survivance, and for my research, I chose to use the definition by Phil Deloria. He describes survivance as a combination of survival and resistance, calls for adaptation and strategic accommodation in order to survive and develop the process that contributes to community growth. By communities, specifically Indigenous communities. My focus is on how Indigenous female students assert their resistance against settler colonialistic mindset in order to create better communities. One of the students I use in my examples is Erica Lord, who graduated from Carleton College in 2000 as a studio art major. She is Alaska Native of Athabaskan and Inupiaq descent. And in her cumulative senior composition project, she chose to assert her identity as well as make a call for action to make Carleton College a more accepting place for Indigenous students. Lord's art exhibit was titled New Narrative Stories from Four Directions, which used a combination of Black and white photos and audio to tell stories. In her interview, she described her work as, I'm speaking to issues that are present in the Native community, how the communities interact. In this particular project, I think a lot about how Native students are represented, what sort of ideas people have about Native people, and a reaction to what I've experienced here at Carleton. In particular, she's talking about countering negative stereotypes or misconceptions that non-Native people have due to the proliferation of settler colonial views that often spread in the media. You can see examples in movies such as Pocahontas, The Lone Ranger, things like that. In her art on campus, she also uses it as a mode to speak on the absence of Indigenous presence previously spoken about. She takes a more emotional approach, and she notices, despite Carleton being on Dakota land, the isolation that comes with being one of the few Indigenous people. Lord's experience speaks to the larger theme that occurred in my research and many others in my thread group about how Carleton College does not recruit Native students, or when there is an attempt to reach out to potential Indigenous students, there's no action to support them while on campus. This feeds back into the larger narrative of college institutions being inherently settler instruments, despite Carleton College not having an explicit connection to Native American genocide. It still benefits from its land dispossession, like spoken earlier by our land group, and in it by refusing to make room for others. In gathering my archive for this research, I chose to focus on newspapers and Carleton archives. I will be passing it off to the next presenter, who uses a different methodological approach to better understand students' experiences.
Hi, thank you, Imani. My name is Zia Noisecat. I'm a sophomore environmental studies major, and I use she, her pronouns. I'm First Nations from the Canam Lake Band in British Columbia. So my work for this class is mainly centered around Indigenous students in STEM and comparisons between the 80s and 90s and now, more specifically how these alumni utilize student organizations to really facilitate their belonging on campus. Most of the work I've done to locate these Indigenous alumni has involved digging around in Carleton's archives, finding names from old faxes, emails, meeting notes, papers helpfully labeled Native American students on campus. So I use these names to cross-reference within Carleton's alumni network and to get in contact information, as well as what they majored in, to find out if they were Indigenous students in STEM. So because our time is so short, I want to focus on 2 of 4 of my interviewees: Jennifer Folsom, who graduated in 1984 in psychology, and Roger Fost, who graduated in 2019 in biology. So from the quotes on this slide, it's apparent that we see this feeling of tokenization being carried out through the 80s to today, with Jennifer identifying that she felt merely as a checked box while she was on campus, and Roger feeling as if the campus looked to him to answer for all Indigenous peoples. And on the next slide, we see that both of these alumni utilize student organizations on campus. Roger discussed his participation in Focus and how the group allowed him to become more connected to professors in STEM and cultivate underrepresented students in science. Focus is a group that's not specifically meant for Indigenous students, but for minority groups within STEM fields. Jennifer also discusses the importance of a group mentioned earlier by Zoe in the 80s, Native Americans with a Future. This is a really beautiful quote from her, so I'd like to read it to you. I asked her, what did Native Americans with a Future, the name, mean to students? And she said, there was this huge narrative in mainstream culture that we were a vanishing people. And for us, it meant a lot, fighting the idea that we were dying cultures. And so rather than naming it something like a regular club, no, this is about empowerment, and to say, what are we doing here with our lives? And so that's how we came up with the name. That was less about a club and more about what we wanted to see happen and how we wanted to be perceived. So while we do see overlapping themes of tokenization of Indigenous students at Carleton, what is most apparent is these students' persistence in creating space for themselves and like where they were most underrepresented. Finally, we see this persistence still happening today. If we go to the next slide, please. Anna, Amani, and myself, with lots of help from Meredith, have recently restarted IPA. We just had our recent first event on Thursday night. We made fry bread tacos, and it was an amazing time and just great to be in an Indigenous space. So with restarting IPA, as mentioned by Zoe, we initially had trouble getting chartered. We found that there were little records to go off of, and we had to restart the group from the bottom up, regardless of the presence of previous groups. So we have been focusing on archiving all of our work, such as budgeting, meeting notes, photos, just making sure that there is something to go off of if the group does dissolve in the future. But overall, our main goal is to continue the persistence of Indigenous students at Carleton. Thank you. So next you'll be hearing from the thread group on representations.
Thank you so much. It was really interesting research. All right, my group worked on research into representations of Indigenous peoples at Carleton, and we will be talking today about erasure, providing examples over about the last 100 years, and talking a bit about what is being done today to combat erasure narratives. So we can get the next slide. And hello, my name is Paulina Buchanan. I use she, her pronouns. I am a junior music and American studies double major, and I will be starting out the representation and erasure section. So erasure refers to how dominant narratives, like the stories of US history that are taught in K-12 education, often exclude Indigenous peoples and histories. This erasure can be enacted in many ways, including generalizing diverse Native nations into one stereotype of indigeneity, many times using the term Indian to accomplish this. The homogenization and consequential erasure of the Dakota and Ojibwe peoples that share geography with Carleton and Minnesota can be seen in the 1926 May Fête at Carleton, which was the focus of my research. The May Fête was an annual spring pageant that Carleton women students put on to crown the May Queen and would perform a skit of some kind. In 1926, the skit was a fictional Indian story and was attended by people from all around the region. As shown in the photo, the performance used a canoe from northern Minnesota, possibly Ojibwe in origin as written by the Carletonian, a totem pole, an item used by some Indigenous peoples on the North Pacific coast, and a teepee, used by some Indigenous peoples of the plains. All of these material items communicate some sense of indigeneity on their own, but used together created a narrative that all Native Americans are the same, thus erasing the distinctiveness of Indigenous peoples and the agency of Indigenous peoples to define their own stories and representations. Additionally, there was no acknowledgement of Dakota or Ojibwe peoples as foundational to the story's creation, even though some of the characters' names were based on Ojibwe language. The direct influence then of real living Ojibwe people was not credited, erasing agency and authorship in this misrepresentation of indigeneity. Erasure also refers to the practice of relegating Indigenous peoples to the past, in what Indigenous education scholar Leilani Zabzalian calls historical narratives of a vanishing race, and doing this instead of highlighting the contemporary Indigenous presence. Language is a major tool for combating or maintaining erasure narratives. Language that designates Indigenous peoples as only living in the past, like Carleton occupies land that was used by the Dakota, erases Indigenous voices, and tells non-Indigenous people that they don't have to think about Indigenous peoples. Words like fantasy, legend, and myth used to describe the Mayfet story did this by locating the plot outside of time and space. This way, non-Indigenous performers and audience members did not have to think about Indigenous peoples existing in the same space and time as themselves. And now I will hand it off to Katie Rose, who will talk about this historical erasure as well.
Thank you, Paulina. It's great to hear how many different ways erasure can show up. My name is Katie Rose, and I'm a sophomore history major. What I really focused on in my project is how narratives of erasure, when they are repeated, can be particularly harmful. This is because they become integrated into the ways we talk about ourselves and our institutions, as well as other people in other institutions. And it shapes our understandings of these different places. In my research, one of the particular narrative places that I focused on is beginnings. So for example, I looked at the 1966 history of Carleton that covers the first century of Carleton's history. On the first page, it has this quote on it. It reads that an institution such as Carleton should be launched in Minnesota was all but inevitable. In 1636, less than 2 decades after the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth, the General Court of the Colony of Massachusetts Bay established Harvard College. And this is really interesting because there are a lot of ways to begin the history of Carleton, but to connect it back 2 centuries before its foundation to specifically Pilgrims is both very familiar because it is something that is familiar to many American public school students as a narrative, but it is also erasing Indigenous peoples very explicitly in the lack of acknowledgement of them. Now, if we can go to the next slide, I looked even more specifically into the archives of the Arboretum. So for example, I looked at different sources that were publicly published by the Arboretum for visitors to understand what the Arboretum represented. For example, I looked at the Nature Trail Bulletins, which Declan explained as working in the Arboretum. I also looked at the Arboretum kiosks, which is a more current representation of the Arboretum that are published as an introduction when you walk in. In both of these, we can have different quotes that represent Indigenous people. In 1941, we have a quote about the Timpsilla plant where it says, Indians boiled the underground tuber-like corms of this plant and esteemed it a great delicacy. In this quote, we see some of the pieces that Paulina talked about with erasure, where it is placing this homogenized narrative onto Indigenous people. This plant isn't something that is across the whole and all of North America. Additionally, it's placing Indigenous people into the past by putting it in the past tense of boiled. Similarly, in 2016 on the Arb kiosk, we see a lot of the same things happening. When it says Indigenous peoples use the stem of yarrow for pain relief, we still have the homogenization and the past tense. And so it is interesting that 70 years later, these narratives are still persistent. And this tells us a lot about the fact that these narratives can't just be undermined by a change in terminology like Indians to Indigenous peoples. You have to undermine the foundational narratives, which comes from individuals and organizations working to change it. So Our next few presenters will talk a little bit about that, and I'll hand it off to Allie.
Hi, everyone. My name is Allie Brown-Law, and I'm a senior environmental studies major. So while we know that Dakota and Ojibwe people in Minnesota Mokoche have continually resisted colonization and assimilation efforts, and not only resisted, but survived despite repeated violence and dispossession, we also know that there was an emergence of Native activism and resistance in the 1960s and 70s, as Anna laid out for us. And a large part of this resistance was through the American Indian movement, which formed in the Twin Cities in 1968. And you can see in this photo a meeting of the first board members in Minneapolis. The American Indian movement, which is also known as AIM, challenged Native people's invisibility within the city and within urban spaces, particularly highlighting police brutality and high arrest rates of Native people in Minneapolis. But AIM also grew to a nationwide movement that challenged the American state to confront its continuing violence against Native Americans. And throughout all of its efforts, AIM advocated for self-determination, wanting Native communities and Native people to be able to decide what is healthy and good for themselves. Next slide, please. With AIM forming only 45 minutes away, it's fascinating to see whether and how Carleton and St. Olaf understood and engaged with Native advocacy during this time. As shown in this Carletonian article, St. Olaf actually hosted AIM attorneys and AIM leader Dennis Banks in 1974 in order to inform the college community about AIM's goals and concerns and the ensuing trial of Dennis Banks in St. Paul. But this is actually one of the most engaged articles from this time period. And from my archival research, I found that during the height of AIM, St. Olaf consistently interfaced more with the movement, whereas Carleton rarely organized on its own. Further, St. Olaf actually hired Native staff members to recruit and support Native students on campus during this period, which led to increased visibility of Native students on Olaf's campus, and as one article termed it, kind of high interest in Native issues on St. Olaf's campus. But at Carleton, the representations and understandings of AIM kind of remained mixed during this time. As Anna also mentioned, there was like a lot of variance in the way that the Carletonian talked about AIM's activism. And this kind of reflects the more national concern from non-Native people about what they saw as militancy in the American Indian movement. But in the 1980s, as Anna and Amani and Zia and Zoe so aptly laid out, we see that more Native students were enrolling in Carleton. And with these Native students at Carleton, they really fought for and opened up new forms of engagement at Carleton through their organization, ANPO. And they actually succeeded in bringing AIM leaders Dennis Banks and later Vernon Belcourt to campus as speakers. And both Banks and Belcourt spoke to the campus about AIM and their goals, really, giving Carleton a direct link to the rhetoric and purpose of AIM. But the fact that AIM leaders were only brought to Carleton significantly after the height of AIM's activism really raises questions about how palatable Native activism can be for predominantly white institutions like Carleton, and like why Carleton didn't engage with AIM during the height of AIM's actual nationwide activism. And more importantly, the fact that Native students had to take this responsibility for bringing AIM leaders to campus and engaging the rest of Carleton with these issues really points to the wide issue of Native students and Native faculty consistently having to be the ones to educate and represent all Native people for predominantly white institutions like Carleton, which really kind of further points to what Zia was finding in her interviews with Native alumni. So now I'm going to pass it to Elias.
Great, thanks so much, Allie. My name is Elias. I use he, him pronouns, and I am a junior environmental studies and history major. And today, sort of following up on this conversation about activism and resistance on campus among the student body, it's also important sort of to examine the college's side of this and the role they played through their course offerings to the students, which is, as a school, a fundamental thing. And so, as you can see here on the slide, I have a few of the Carleton College course offering catalogs that they release every year and are now preserved in the archive. And so this follows the narrative, this idea of combating erasure and sort of focusing through academia by providing a relevant education. And this means both providing a relevant education to Native students, but also to non-Native students, and combating ignorance generally. And so the general idea is that sort of combating this can consist of course offerings which sort of challenge previously harmful narratives, and then also the faculty that Carleton employs, as well as research that faculty and students are doing on campus. And so looking back, my research has gone through these, the brochures, and that's been foundational to it. And although Carleton offered a brief stint of anthropology courses in the 1930s that focused on Indigenous peoples, these courses appeared to primarily have promoted racist views and to have relegated Indigenous peoples to antiquity. And so my research hasn't focused much on this, and rather it's primarily focused on the time period from the 1970s to the 1980s, where we start to see Indigenous focused courses reappear in Carleton course offerings. And so primarily, I have focused on this sort of transition moment in the 70s and 80s, where we see primarily just 2 courses being offered, both starting in the 70s and running intermittently through the 80s. And my work is primarily focused on analyzing these courses and the professors who taught them to see how effectively they were able to combat narratives, and whether they perpetuated harmful ones as well. And then moving forward beyond that, we see a new rise in courses sort of in the 90s leading up through the 2000s, where Indigenous focused courses were offered more often and in a broader variety of fields as well. But it's important to note that to this day, there still is no formal Native Studies department on our campus. And now I will turn this over to Thomas to further this discussion.
Yeah, thanks, Elias. Hi, everybody. My name is Thomas White. I am a junior American Studies major at Carleton. I use he, him pronouns. So although we are a history class, it's important to conclude this presentation by framing this history in the context of the present. So obviously, the history that we have so far covered in this presentation, such as histories of land dispossession, student underrepresentation, and narrative erasure, don't exist in a vacuum, but continue to affect the way that Native peoples are understood and are treated in Minnesota and across the United States today. Some recent research conducted by the Native organization Illuminative reveals that contradictory stereotypes continue to shape the portrayals of Native peoples in media, politics, and popular opinion today. So, for example, this research shows that 2 of the most widespread narratives that define Native peoples today are being deeply impoverished while also unfairly benefiting off of casino dollars and government handouts. And so the consequences of these paradoxical narratives are extremely significant, although a majority of Americans believe that Native peoples have and continue to experience discrimination, there is a stark underestimation of the severity of its impacts. And an example of this is that under 0.3% of total US philanthropic foundations support efforts which explicitly benefit Native Americans. And so when we talk about erasure, this is what we mean. Nevertheless, as always, Native peoples actively resist these harmful narratives through a variety of ways. And that leads me to my paper. And unlike the rest of my class, each of whom primarily centered their paper on the history of Carleton, Native peoples, in Minnesota, my goal was to connect this history to the present and highlight the active presence of Native peoples and the 11 Native nations which share geography with Minnesota. And I wrote my paper in collaboration with an exciting new nonprofit organization, which Meredith mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, called We Are Still Here Minnesota, which works on the forefront of narrative change efforts about Native peoples in Minnesota. And I'll do a quick shout out to Ramona, who's the director of this organization, and she's here today. And so, as I said in my paper, I sought to document what Native organizations and tribal governments are currently doing to combat deficit narratives and exercise their inherent sovereignty. And so I divided my paper into 3 sections, being education, narrative change, and sovereignty. And I could talk about this for hours, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to quickly highlight 2 examples which summarize these topics well. In the realm of education, many tribal nations operate schools and programs designed to meet the specific needs of their own young people. And Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe is a great example of this, as they recently developed a program for its young people grounded on traditional Anishinaabe approaches to early childhood education, which includes like spending a significant amount of time in natural outdoor spaces and the woods, and grounding the educational experience in that environment. And not only is this an example of education grounded upon Anishinaabe and Native principles, but it's also an example of a collaborative partnership between a Native nation and a non-Native institution, as this program was cultivated in partnership with the University of Minnesota, grounded on research conducted by students there, and designed by the design process was also assisted in that way. And secondly, the Shakopee Medwakatan Sioux community is a great example of how some tribal nations and organizations pursue narrative change efforts. And there are 2 things that are significant about Shakopee's approach, which first of all being that they have recently launched a campaign to improve the narrative surrounding Native peoples in Minnesota schools called Understand Native Minnesota. And I'm going to put a link in the chat which is a link to subscribing to their weekly or monthly newsletter, which would be emailed to you, which goes over their current work and related issues today, which I can't recommend enough. It's very revealing about what work is going on. But additionally, Shakopee attempts to combat deficit narratives about Native peoples by leading by example. Their recent donation history speaks to this, as over the past 25 years, they have donated over $350 million to Native organizations and local businesses across Minnesota and the larger regional area. And in 2019 alone, they donated over $15 million. And so although Carleton and Northfield are not the center of my research, I hope for my work to reinforce the active presence of Native peoples and nations today, and encourage thinking about new ways to counter historical and contemporary injustices. And a recent example of this sort of work is the land acknowledgement recently passed by Northfield. With this land acknowledgement, Northfield pledged a responsibility not only to recognize wrongs of the past, but to support Native peoples in the present and future by critically examining how its past influences the present. And so in our class, we call this practice honest storytelling. And honest storytelling is it comes with 3 core principles, which Meredith, would you be able to switch to the next slide? Thank you. So honest storytelling comes with 3 core principles. The first of all, to recognize historical and contemporary injustices, to actively seek and amplify accurate narratives, and to listen to Native peoples with open ears. And we hope that our class serves as an example of the work it takes to practice honest storytelling. So as a class, we dug into the depths of Carleton's archives. We relearned Carleton's history, the history of Minnesota, and the history of the United States, oftentimes in a way that can shake you to the core, because these narratives are ingrained in the nature of reality of our country. But we also realize that our research is essential to create a future which supports the well-being of Native peoples. So nevertheless, we only scratched the surface of this work. And it will take a long time to grapple with deficit narratives and biased history. But our class marks the beginning of this work at Carleton, and to create a brighter future for Indigenous peoples in Minnesota and across the United States. Thank you everyone for attending today and for your time.
Chimagwech to all of the students. If you wouldn't mind folks joining me in giving the students a round of applause, please, for their presentations and for their excellent research. Thank you so much. At this point, we do have some time for questions, just a few minutes. I had promised the students that I would let them go as close to noon as possible. There are campus events happening today that they would very much like to be at. So we will take time for just a couple of questions before we turn them loose to go back to campus. Please feel free to drop your questions into the chat or to use the raised hand function, and I will be happy to call on you. There is a question at the chat that I will direct to the folks for whom St. Olaf came up in their research. The question is, why did St. Olaf take such a lead? And I'll read the comment in its entirety. African-American students at St. Olaf created a cultural union for Black expression, or CUBE, in 1968 and 69. It produced a fee university offering courses on numerous topics not in the college curriculum, open to the Northfield public. History professor Henry Fritz, whose expertise was Native American studies, parlayed that activity into a National Endowment in the Humanities grant to establish what would be only the second American Minority Studies program, now Race and Ethnic Studies department in the nation. Matt Rohn, thank you so much for sharing that information with us. Folks who had information about St. Olaf, what else can you tell us about maybe why St. Olaf did more than Carleton at the time?
I think that would probably be my project to talk about, but thank you so much for this information. I actually didn't know part of what you included in this comment, but one of the things that I briefly mentioned in my presentation was that during the 70s, St. Olaf actually hired a Native staff member, Phil Allen, and then later hired Larry Martin, if I'm not mistaken. So that was in 1970 and then 1976 when those two men were hired. And Phil Allen was Dakota and was a Native Native staff member that was both working on recruitment of Native students to St. Olaf, but also support of Native students while they were at St. Olaf. And now I don't necessarily know whether, I can't say for sure whether having a Native faculty member on campus can immediately lend itself to more engagement on campus, but I do know that during that exact same time, Carleton had very few Native students. There were 3 brothers who graduated kind of in successive years during the 70s that were Native at Carleton. But a lot of the broader Carleton community didn't know that those people were Native. There was an article that said there are no Native students at Carleton's campus right now, even though those brothers were on campus. So it's like, again, these narratives of invisibility where not only were there Native students at Carleton that, weren't really recognized as being Native, and that could have been for their own, they might not have wanted to identify as Native, which is completely fine. But I think that part of having that Native faculty at St. Olaf and really having an intentional effort to recruit Native students definitely just means that there might have been broader conversations happening at St. Olaf about, what does it mean to recruit Native students? Why do we want Native students to be at St. Olaf? And then that could lead to more kind of engagement with the activism of the period. So that's something that I came across in my research. But again, in some ways, it's like, why? That's still a question for me. Why didn't Carleton do more during this time?
Thank you so much, Allie. Let's take maybe one more question.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, is that Joan?
Yes, it is.
Hi, Joan. Yes, go right ahead.
Hi. There's one other person that I know St. Olaf hired, although I can't remember her exact years, and it's Melanie Hickey, who I think has an Ojibwe background. And she was very central to the life of Native American awareness on the St. Olaf campus. And she was the head of what became the Multicultural Office, which changed names over time. Now it's the Taylor Center. She was an incredibly important force. And then, as speaking of economic backing, it was important that a figure, an African-American, a Caribbean-American, Marcella Taylor, was very instrumental in shaping the financial reins for multicultural studies that generated different concentrations, Latin and all the way through the other groups, including Africa and the African diaspora at St. Olaf. What's interesting about this when we talk about narratives is that always the erasure shows up both with natives and African Americans. There is very little in the archives about Marcella's contributions, and they were huge. She created the film studies programs. She started the poetry. The real strength of the poetry offerings at St. Olaf and this multicultural, and she doesn't get credit for those contributions any more than I have seen, although I haven't done a careful look, but I don't suspect that Melanie Hickey got much voice. And often the language that comes from these figures is co-opted or not named. And so it really takes some digging, and it takes real honest storytelling, which was important to me in that language of the land acknowledgement.
Thank you so much, Joan. And students, you may not know Joan, but Joan's land acknowledgement at the MLK event was really what kicked off Northfield's current movement towards the land acknowledgement. So we owe Joan a great debt in her push in town on St. Olaf's campus and for us at Carleton. So Joan, thank you for being here, and thank you for sharing those comments with us. I'll point y'all towards a conversation happening in the chat as well. And with that, I'm gonna wrap us up so the students can go and enjoy events happening on campus for the weekend. Students, thank you again for sharing your knowledge and research with us, and everyone in the room, thank you for spending your Saturday morning with us. We so appreciate your attention and time, and we look forward to remaining in conversation about this with you in the future. Go Admin, be well. Thank you.